Why? Being a Byzantine Empress is so terrible. Imagine the city of Constantinople just before dawn. The sky is still dark above the Bosporus, and waters below are moving quietly between Europe and Asia. A few lamps burn along the streets. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell sounds through the cool air. The stone walls of the Imperial palace are almost silent. Inside those walls, however, someone is already awake. She is an empress. From the outside, her life may appear almost impossibly comfortable. She lives in a palace. Servants wait for her. Fine fabrics surround her. Gold glitters in the churches she enters. Her meals are prepared by others, and her clothing can be made from materials that most people in the empire will never touch. Yet beneath all that luxury is a life filled with rules. An empress in the Byzantine Empire did not simply wake up and decide what she wanted to do. Her position depended on a complicated mixture of family, marriage, religion, politics, ceremony, and fortune. A woman could rise from a relatively modest background and eventually become one of the most powerful people in the Roman world. But she could also lose that position with astonishing speed. Her husband could die. A rival could gain influence. A rebellion could begin. A new emperor could replace the old one. A marriage could become politically inconvenient. And sometimes, the safest thing for an empress was to remain perfectly still, while everyone around her quietly decided what her future would be. This was the world of the Byzantine Empire, although the people who lived there usually did not call themselves Byzantines. They considered themselves Romans. Their empire was the continuation of the Roman Empire in the Eastern Mediterranean. Constantinople, founded by Constantine the Great in the 4th century, had become its magnificent center. By the medieval period, the city was enormous by European standards. Its streets could be crowded with merchants, soldiers, priests, laborers, officials, sailors, and travelers. The smell of bread might drift from a bakery. Fish could be carried from the markets near the water. Donkeys moved through narrow streets. Traders spoke different languages. Incense floated from churches. And above this complicated city stood the Imperial palace. For an empress, the palace was both a home and a carefully controlled world. You find yourself entering it slowly. There are courtyards, halls, gardens, chapels, rooms for officials, apartments for members of the imperial household, and spaces where ceremonies are performed according to traditions that could be extremely old. Nothing is entirely casual. A person does not simply walk into the emperor's presence. A person does not casually approach the empress. There are ranks. There are rituals. There are titles. There are expectations about clothing, posture, speech, and movement. And the higher the person stands, the more carefully every action can be watched. This is one of the strange contradictions of imperial life. The empress may possess enormous wealth and influence, while having less ordinary freedom than a woman living far outside the palace. A farmer's wife might have to work hard from morning until evening, but she could move around her village without an elaborate ceremony. An empress could possess gold and servants, yet even her appearance in public might be surrounded by rules. Her life was visible. Her family mattered. Her children mattered. Her marriage mattered. Her religious behavior mattered. Even her silence could sometimes matter. To understand why, we need to step back from the palace for a moment. The Byzantine Empire was a deeply Christian society. Religion was not simply something people practiced on a particular day of the week. It shaped the calendar, political ceremonies, public spaces, ideas about marriage, ideas about sin, and ideas about legitimate authority. The emperor was not considered a modern secular president. Imperial power existed within a Christian understanding of the world. The emperor was expected to protect the empire and support the Christian faith. The empress was therefore not merely the emperor's wife. Her position could carry religious and symbolic importance. She might appear beside him during ceremonies. She could take part in charitable activities. She could support monasteries and churches. She might influence appointments and political decisions. She could possess property and wealth. And in some periods, an empress could exercise remarkable political authority. But this influence came with an uncomfortable truth. Everyone knew that an empress was connected to the emperor, and that meant everyone had an interest in her. Her relatives might want access to power. Officials might try to gain her support. Military leaders might watch her family. Religious figures might judge her behavior. Foreign rulers might care about her marriage. Court factions could form around her household. The empress therefore lived at the center of a web. Every thread could pull in a different direction. Imagine waking in the morning, knowing that the people around you are not simply servants and friends. Some may be loyal. Some may be frightened. Some may be ambitious. Some may be waiting for a political opportunity. And almost all of them understand that your family name has value. This was especially important because Byzantine politics could be unpredictable. The empire experienced long periods of stability, but it also experienced rebellions, civil wars, palace conspiracies, military defeats, religious disputes, and sudden changes of dynasty. An empress could therefore move from security to danger without warning. One day she might sit beside the emperor during a magnificent ceremony. Years later, she might be forced into a monastery. Sometimes imperial women were sent away from political life after their husbands or sons lost power. Monastic retirement was not always a punishment in the modern sense. Byzantine monasteries could provide a respectable and protected environment for aristocratic women. But being sent there because someone else had lost a political struggle was another matter. The palace could disappear from your daily life almost overnight. The silks would be replaced by simpler clothing. The sound of court ceremonies would fade. Instead of officials waiting for instructions, there might be the quiet rhythm of prayer. The world would become smaller, and perhaps that was precisely the point. For an empress, marriage itself could be complicated. Today, we often imagine marriage as primarily a private relationship between two people. In the Byzantine imperial world, marriage could also be an instrument of diplomacy and succession. A future emperor needed a suitable wife. A woman who married into the imperial family could suddenly become part of the highest political circle. Her relatives could benefit from the connection. Her children could become heirs. Her homeland could gain prestige. Foreign rulers could gain a link to Constantinople. This meant that an empress was rarely only an individual. She could represent a family. Sometimes she represented a dynasty. Sometimes she represented an alliance. And sometimes she represented the possibility of continuing the imperial bloodline. Childbirth, therefore, had political importance. An imperial son could become a future emperor. But pregnancy and childbirth were dangerous for women throughout the medieval world. Medical knowledge was limited. Infections could not be treated with modern antibiotics. Serious bleeding could be fatal. Complications during labor could become deadly. An empress might have access to better food, servants, physicians, and comfortable surroundings than many other women, but she still lived in a world where childbirth could not be made safe. A palace could be covered in marble. Its doors could be decorated with precious metals. Its rooms could contain beautiful mosaics. But none of that could guarantee a safe delivery. Picture yourself in an imperial residence during winter. Outside, cold air moves over the city. The sea is dark. Inside, servants carry warm water. A fire burns somewhere nearby. Women of the household move quietly between rooms. A physician waits. A midwife may be present. Everyone understands that something important is happening. The future of a dynasty may depend on a child who has not yet entered the world, and the mother herself is facing a danger that no imperial title can remove. If the child survives, the palace celebrates. If the child is a boy, the political meaning may be especially significant in a society where male succession was often preferred. But daughters could also matter enormously. Imperial daughters could marry powerful men. They could strengthen alliances. They could become influential members of the court. They could sometimes remain unmarried and live within religious institutions. And they could become political figures in their own right. The Byzantine Empire produced women of extraordinary political influence. But it is important not to imagine that every empress had the same kind of power. The title did not automatically give a woman complete control. Some empresses exercised considerable authority. Others were influential mainly through their families. Some were respected, some were feared, some were remembered for religious patronage, some became involved in succession struggles, and some disappeared from the historical record almost completely. This is one of the quiet difficulties of studying Byzantine women. The sources were usually written by men. They were often interested in emperors, wars, religious disputes, and political events. An empress might appear in the record because she did something politically important, but the ordinary texture of her life could remain invisible. We may know that she founded a monastery. We may know that she influenced a decision. We may know that she appeared in a ceremony. But we may not know what she thought while sitting alone in her room at night. We may not know whether she enjoyed the gardens. We may not know which servants she trusted. We may not know whether she feared a particular official. History often gives us the large shapes of a life while leaving its quietest moments hidden. So tonight, we will move slowly through those larger structures. We will not imagine that every Byzantine empress suffered in exactly the same way. Instead, we will explore the pressures that could make imperial womanhood difficult. The palace was beautiful. But beauty does not always mean freedom. A golden room can still be a room with a locked door, and a crown can sometimes feel less like jewelry and more like a weight. To understand this, we can begin with the journey that brought a woman into the imperial household. Not every empress was born an empress. Some came from wealthy aristocratic families. Others had backgrounds that were much less prestigious. The Byzantine court could be surprisingly complicated when choosing a bride for an emperor. Physical appearance mattered in some accounts. Family connections mattered. Religious background mattered. Political circumstances mattered. The emperor's personal preferences could matter too. The stories surrounding certain imperial marriages have been repeated for centuries, sometimes with details that are difficult to verify. So it is safer to imagine the broader reality. A young woman selected for an imperial marriage could suddenly find herself leaving the familiar world of her childhood. The journey to Constantinople might be long. Roads could be rough. Sea travel could be uncomfortable. The landscape would change. Villages would pass. Mountains would appear and disappear. Eventually, the great city would rise before her. Constantinople was unlike most places she had known. Its massive land walls stretched across the city. Its harbors connected it to distant lands. Its churches rose above crowded neighborhoods. The great palace complex stood near the heart of imperial power. For a young bride entering this world, the first impression must have been overwhelming. Yet the palace did not necessarily mean immediate comfort. She had entered a new social universe. There were unfamiliar customs. There were unfamiliar faces. There were servants who knew the routines better than she did. There were officials who understood exactly where they belonged. There were women of the imperial household who might become companions, rivals, or both. And there was the emperor. He was not simply her husband. He was the most powerful man in the empire. That changed the nature of marriage. A disagreement between an ordinary married couple might remain inside the home. A disagreement between an emperor and empress could become a political matter. If the empress supported one faction and the emperor supported another, their private relationship could have public consequences. If she strongly favored the interests of her relatives, opponents might accuse her of interfering. If she was seen as too passive, others might regard her household as weak. If she became too powerful, opponents could portray her as dangerous. There was often no perfect position. Too little influence could make an empress irrelevant. Too much influence could make her threatening. And so she had to move carefully. The palace was filled with people who understood the value of appearances. A gesture could be interpreted. A marriage could be discussed. A relative could become suspicious. A religious donation could strengthen an alliance. A public appearance could send a message. Even generosity could have political meaning. Imperial women often supported religious institutions and charitable works. This was part of the expected role of Christian rulers. Helping the poor, supporting churches, founding monasteries, and providing patronage could demonstrate piety. But it could also strengthen an empress's reputation. Her name could become connected with a church. Her foundation could survive long after her death. In this way, an empress could create a legacy outside the immediate political world of the palace. Some imperial women became especially famous for such patronage. They could use wealth to support buildings, religious communities, and charitable institutions. The physical remains of Byzantine architecture sometimes allow us to see traces of these women more clearly than written sources do. A church could survive. A mosaic could survive. An inscription could survive. The woman herself might be gone for centuries, but her name could remain attached to stone. There is something peaceful about that. Imagine walking through a Byzantine church long after the emperor and empress have died. The lamps are no longer burning. The court has disappeared. The political arguments are forgotten, but the walls remain. Light enters through a window. The stone floor is cool beneath your feet. And somewhere in the history of that building is the memory of a woman who once had the wealth and authority to make it possible. Yet even such achievements existed within strict expectations. An empress was expected to behave with dignity. Christian ideals of modesty and chastity were important. The imperial household was watched closely. Sexual behavior mattered politically because legitimacy mattered. If an emperor's marriage produced legitimate children, those children could become part of the succession. Questions surrounding adultery could therefore become more than private scandals. They could threaten reputations and political stability. Women of the imperial household could be judged harshly for behavior that male rulers sometimes escaped with fewer consequences. This unequal standard was not unique to Byzantium. It existed in many medieval societies. But at the imperial court, the consequences could be particularly severe. A rumor could spread. A rival could use it. A court historian could record it. And centuries later, readers might know the accusation without knowing whether it was true. This is another reason to be careful when reading Byzantine history. The sources sometimes tell us what someone was accused of, but not necessarily what really happened. An empress who opposed a powerful political faction might be described as ambitious. An empress who supported religious reforms might be described as pious. An empress who acted forcefully could be portrayed as domineering. The language of historical writers was shaped by their own expectations. So, when we look back, we must listen carefully. The women of the palace were real people. They were not simply villains, saints, schemers, or beautiful figures in old stories. They were human beings living inside a difficult political system. And sometimes, the most interesting question is not whether an empress was good or bad. It is what choices were actually available to her. Consider succession. This was perhaps one of the greatest pressures surrounding imperial women. The Byzantine Empire did not follow one simple, permanent rule saying exactly who would inherit the throne. In practice, succession could depend on many factors. Family relationships mattered. Military support mattered. Political alliances mattered. Popular opinion in Constantinople could matter. The church and powerful officials could matter. And sometimes, force mattered most of all. An emperor might have a son. That son might be young. If the emperor died while the heir was still a child, the child's mother could suddenly become extremely important. She might serve as regent. She might help guide the government. She might defend her child's position. This could give an empress extraordinary authority. But it also placed a target on her back. A child emperor was vulnerable. Anyone who wanted the throne could see an opportunity. The mother, therefore, had to protect the child while managing powerful adults. She had to negotiate with officials. She might need the support of military leaders. She might need religious legitimacy. She might need money. And she had to be careful not to appear so powerful that the adult political elite decided she herself was the problem. Imagine being responsible for a child whose crown is already being discussed by grown men. You are trying to keep him safe. You are trying to maintain the empire. And somewhere beyond the palace walls, Soldiers are moving across roads you cannot see. Messages arrive. Seals are broken. Letters are read. Rumors travel faster than certainty. At night, the palace becomes quiet again. But you know that quiet does not mean safety. This was one of the strange burdens of imperial motherhood. A son could be your greatest source of security. He could also be the center of your greatest danger. A daughter could strengthen a political alliance through marriage, also be the center of your greatest danger. A daughter could strengthen a political alliance through marriage. A son could create a succession. But children could also become the reason rival factions turned against their mother. The imperial family was therefore both a family and a political institution. It was difficult to separate the two. And perhaps that is what made being an empress so exhausting. There was rarely a moment when personal life could remain entirely personal. A birthday could have political meaning. A marriage could change alliances. A pregnancy could affect succession. A funeral could transform the balance of power. Even grief could become political. When an emperor died, the empress might mourn her husband while simultaneously facing questions about what would happen next. Who would rule? Who would protect the heirs? Which officials would remain loyal? Would the army accept the successor? Would the people accept the new emperor? Would another member of the imperial family claim the throne? The funeral itself could become part of the transition. The palace would change. The rhythm of life would change. And the woman who had been an emperor's wife could suddenly become the mother, widow, regent, or relative of the next ruler. Her identity had shifted overnight. This is why the Byzantine imperial palace could feel strangely unstable. It was a place of extraordinary continuity. The Roman state had survived for centuries. Traditions were carefully preserved. Ceremonies connected the present with the distant past. But individual lives could change very quickly. A woman might enter the palace as a bride. She might become an empress, then a mother, then a widow, then a regent, then perhaps a nun. Or she might remain influential for decades. There was no single path. The palace could elevate a person, and the palace could consume a person. As the morning slowly arrives over Constantinople, the city begins to wake. Bread ovens become warm. Market stalls begin to open. Ships move slowly across the water. People step into the streets. From the palace, the city may look almost peaceful. But inside the imperial household, another day of carefully measured life begins. The empress dresses. Her attendants prepare the clothing appropriate for the occasion. Jewelry may be arranged. Her hair may be prepared. She may hear reports from servants or officials. Perhaps there is a religious ceremony. Perhaps visitors are expected. Perhaps correspondence has arrived from a distant province. Perhaps nothing dramatic happens at all, and that last possibility is worth remembering. Most of imperial life was not made of rebellions and conspiracies. There were ordinary hours, meals, prayer, conversation, walking, rest, waiting. The soft sound of fabric moving across a floor, the faint smell of wax from lamps, the warmth of a room during winter, the coolness of stone corridors in the morning. History often remembers the moments when everything changed. But an empress had to live through all the ordinary hours between those moments. And perhaps that is where the true difficulty of imperial life becomes clearer. Power did not mean freedom, luxury did not mean peace, and a crown did not mean that the woman wearing it controlled her own destiny. Sometimes she controlled a great deal. Sometimes she controlled almost nothing. The difference could depend on the emperor beside her, the children around her, the officials beneath her, the generals outside the palace, and the political winds moving through Constantinople. Tonight, we will keep moving slowly through that world. Beyond the palace doors, the empire stretches across seas and mountains. Within those walls, a woman waits for the next message. She does not yet know whether it will bring good news. For now, there is only the quiet palace, the fading darkness outside, and the soft movement of another Byzantine morning beginning. And as the city wakes beneath the pale light, the story of the Empress continues. The morning has fully arrived now. Light spreads slowly across Constantinople, touching the domes, rooftops, harbors, and ancient walls. From the Bosporus comes the smell of salt water. Somewhere below the palace, merchants are beginning another day of bargaining. Bakers are carrying warm loaves into the streets, and the sound of footsteps grows steadily louder. But inside the imperial household, the day has already been carefully arranged. For an empress, time itself could be controlled by ceremony. There were occasions when she was expected to appear. There were people she was expected to receive. There were religious observances she was expected to attend. There were clothes appropriate for different occasions. There were formal greetings. There were ranks. And there were countless people whose job was to make sure that the imperial household moved according to tradition. To someone living today, such attention to ceremony might seem exhausting. But ceremony was not simply decoration. In the Byzantine world, ceremony helped explain who possessed authority. The emperor stood at the center of the political order. The empress stood close to that center. Her position was visible through where she stood, how she entered a room, who approached her, and which occasions she attended. Even the smallest details could communicate status. Imagine walking through the palace, surrounded by people who know exactly what every gesture means. A servant approaches and bows. An official waits at a distance. Another person is permitted to come closer. Someone else must remain outside. No one needs to explain the rules. Everyone already knows them, except perhaps the new empress. For a woman arriving at court for the first time, learning these rules could take time. The palace had its own language of behavior. It had its own rhythm. It had its own hierarchy, and mistakes could be embarrassing. A person who misunderstood a ceremony might appear disrespectful. A person who showed too much familiarity might appear careless. A person who ignored protocol might offend someone powerful. So the empress had to learn not only how to be herself, but how to perform the role expected of her. This was particularly important because Byzantine imperial culture placed great importance on dignity. The imperial family was supposed to appear orderly. The empire itself was imagined as an organized Christian Roman state. If the imperial household looked confused, divided, or undisciplined, that could become politically dangerous. The empress therefore had to understand that she was always representing something larger than herself. Her clothing could represent rank. Her public behavior could represent the dignity of the dynasty. Her religious devotion could represent the faith of the imperial household. Her children could represent the future. Her relatives could represent political connections. And her marriage represented a bond at the very top of the empire. This made ordinary mistakes feel larger than they might otherwise have been. Yet perhaps the most difficult part was that the rules were not always written down in a simple handbook. Much of court behavior was learned through experience. You watched, you listened, you remembered. You noticed how senior women behaved. You noticed how officials addressed the emperor. You learned which people could be trusted. And slowly, the palace became less unfamiliar. But becoming comfortable in the palace did not mean becoming safe. One of the great realities of Byzantine political life was faction. The empire was governed by people with different interests. Aristocratic families had their own networks. Military commanders had influence. Court officials controlled access to the ruler. Religious leaders could shape public opinion. Provincial elites had their own ambitions. And members of the imperial family could become centers of competing loyalties. An empress could therefore find herself surrounded by people who wanted something from her. A cousin might want a position. A brother might want financial support. A general might want influence. A bishop might want imperial protection. A monastery might seek a donation. A foreign ruler might want a marriage alliance. A court official might simply want to remain close to power. Not every request was dishonest. Many were normal parts of political life. But the empress had to distinguish between friendship, duty, persuasion, and manipulation. That could be difficult. The people around her had reasons to flatter her. Some might praise her wisdom. Others might praise her beauty. Others might insist that her family was the most loyal family in the empire. The empress had to listen without believing everything. A careless promise could create problems. A generous gift could create expectations. A relative given too much authority could become dangerous. And refusing everyone could create enemies. So imperial women often had to navigate a narrow path. They needed relationships, but relationships could become liabilities. They needed influence, but visible influence could attract suspicion. They needed loyalty. But choosing the wrong person could have consequences. This becomes especially important when we consider the role of family. Byzantine society placed great importance on family connections, and the imperial household was no exception. An empress did not leave her relatives behind when she entered the palace. Her family might gain status because of her marriage. Her relatives might receive appointments or honors. Her brothers might become officials. Her sisters might enter advantageous marriages. Her parents might gain prestige. This could strengthen the dynasty, but it could also create accusations of favoritism. If an empress promoted her relatives, opponents could say that she was putting family above the empire. If she refused to help them, her own family might become resentful. There was no perfect solution. Imagine receiving a letter from a brother asking for help. Perhaps he is genuinely in difficulty. Perhaps he needs money. Perhaps he wants an official position. Perhaps he believes that because you are empress, you have a duty to help him. You read the letter slowly. You know that helping him may anger another powerful family. You know that refusing him may damage your relationship with your own relatives. The decision may seem personal, but it is not entirely personal anymore. Your family is part of politics. Your marriage is part of politics. Even your generosity can become part of politics. This was one of the hidden burdens of imperial women. Their relationships could become public property. And the larger the empire became, the more complicated those relationships could become. The Byzantine Empire was connected to many regions. Its interests reached across the Balkans, Anatolia, the Aegean, the Eastern Mediterranean, and, at different times, much farther. Foreign rulers watched Constantinople. Diplomats arrived at the imperial court. Marriage alliances could connect Byzantine rulers with neighboring dynasties. An imperial bride could therefore become a diplomatic bridge. A daughter of the imperial family might marry a foreign ruler. A foreign princess might arrive in Constantinople and become an empress. Such marriages could be elegant and ceremonial. But behind the ceremonies were political calculations. Who benefited? What alliance was being created? What territory might be protected? What religious questions might arise? What would happen if the alliance collapsed? The woman at the center of the marriage might have very little control over those larger decisions. Picture yourself as a young woman arriving from a distant court. You know your own language. You know your family's customs. You know the streets of your childhood city. Now you are standing in Constantinople. The buildings are different. The food may taste different. The language around you may sound unfamiliar. The court's expectations may be strange. And everyone knows why you are here. You are not merely a guest. You are part of an alliance. You are expected to become part of the imperial family. And perhaps one day, you will be expected to give birth to its next generation. It is difficult to imagine a more complicated way to begin married life. Yet foreign women could also bring their own traditions into Constantinople. The imperial court was not isolated from the wider world. It was a meeting place of cultures. Women who entered the court from different regions could bring languages, customs, religious traditions, and connections. Over time, some became deeply integrated into Byzantine society. Others remained associated with their foreign origins. Their backgrounds could become part of how historians later described them. But regardless of where she came from, an empress eventually had to understand one thing. The court could change very quickly. One of the most important moments in an empress's life could be the death of her husband. For an ordinary widow, grief was already difficult. For an imperial widow, grief could arrive alongside a political crisis. The emperor's death created a question that could affect the entire empire. Who would rule now? If there was an adult son, the answer might be relatively straightforward. But even then, powerful people could have different ideas. If the heir was a child, the situation became more complicated. The empress might become regent. A regent governs on behalf of someone who cannot yet rule independently. This could give a woman extraordinary authority. But it also meant that she had to survive among adults who might not want her authority to last. She might need to negotiate with military commanders. She might need to work with senior officials. She might need to maintain the support of the church. She might need to protect her children, and she might need to prevent ambitious relatives from taking control. The position could be both powerful and frightening. Imagine the palace after the emperor's death. The same corridors are still there. The same marble floors remain beneath your feet. The same lamps burn. But everything feels different. People speak more quietly. Messages arrive more frequently. Officials gather in private rooms. The guards are more alert. The emperor's chair is empty, and everyone is wondering what happens next. The widow who sits nearby may suddenly be the most important woman in the empire. She may also be one of the most vulnerable. This tension can be seen in the history of several Byzantine empresses and imperial women. Some managed to protect their children's positions. Others lost power. Some were forced into religious retirement. Some continued to influence politics from behind the scenes. And a few eventually ruled as emperors in their own right. The distinction between empress as wife and empress as ruler is important. A woman could be an empress because she was married to the emperor. But some women became rulers in their own names. This was unusual, but it happened. Perhaps the most famous example is Irene of Athens, who became ruler of the Byzantine Empire in the late 8th century. Her political career was extraordinary. She initially served as regent for her son, Constantine VI. Eventually, she became the sole ruler. She even used the masculine imperial title in official contexts. Her reign was controversial, especially because of her role in the deposition and blinding of her own son. Her story reminds us that imperial women were not simply passive figures waiting inside the palace. Some could become central political actors. But Irene's story also reveals how dangerous such power could be. When a woman exercised authority at the very top of a society that usually expected male rulers, her legitimacy could be questioned. Every political decision could be examined. Every opponent could use gender against her. Every failure could become evidence that she should not have ruled. Every success could create new enemies. This did not mean Byzantine society considered women incapable of influence. It did mean that female rule had to operate within a complicated political and cultural framework. Later, centuries produced other powerful imperial women. Zoe and Theodora, for example, became co-empresses in the 11th century. Their story is unusual because both sisters eventually held imperial authority. Theodora, in particular, later ruled independently. The palace could therefore become a place where women exercised genuine sovereign power. Yet even then, personal life and political life remained deeply connected. Marriage could affect the throne. A husband's death could change the balance. A sister's relationship could affect the succession. Court officials could become powerful, and the public image of the imperial women mattered. Theodora's story also shows another reality of palace life. An empress could spend years inside an environment where nearly everyone knew her name, yet where very few people could truly be trusted. The palace was not simply a place of luxury. It was a place of surveillance, not necessarily surveillance in the modern sense of hidden cameras and electronic records. Rather, it was social observation. People watched. People listened. People remembered. Servants knew who visited whom. Officials knew which faction had influence. Relatives knew who received gifts. Religious figures knew who attended services. Rumors moved through networks of people. And in a world without modern communication technology, information could still travel surprisingly quickly. A whisper in a corridor could become a story in another part of the palace. A political accusation could move from the court into the city. The public could become involved. This mattered because Constantinople was not a silent city. The people of the capital could influence politics. Crowds could gather. The hippodrome could become a place of enormous public energy. The emperor and empress were not completely separated from the population. They appeared in ceremonies. They were seen in religious processions. They were associated with victories, disasters, festivals, and public acts of charity. The city's opinion could matter, and that meant the imperial couple had to perform their role not only for the court, but also for the wider population. The empress's public image, therefore, mattered greatly. She was expected to embody dignity. Her generosity could become famous. Her piety could become famous. Her appearance could be discussed. Her behavior could be judged. And because Byzantine society was Christian, religious expectations were especially important. An empress was expected to show devotion. She might support churches. She might visit holy places. She might give gifts to religious institutions. She might assist charitable foundations. These actions could be sincere expressions of faith. They could also reinforce her legitimacy. The two things were not necessarily separate. For many Byzantine people, political authority and religious responsibility were deeply connected. An empress could therefore gain respect by being seen as a protector of the Christian community. But religious controversies could also create danger. The Byzantine Empire experienced major disputes over Christian doctrine and religious practice. Questions about icons, for example, became politically explosive during the periods known as Byzantine iconoclasm. The use and veneration of religious images divided people for generations. Imperial rulers sometimes supported restrictions on icons. Others supported their restoration. Women of the imperial family could become involved in these disputes. The empress's religious position could therefore have political consequences. An imperial woman who supported icons might become a hero to one group and an opponent to another. A ruler who opposed them could face the reverse. This meant that faith was not always a quiet, personal matter. At certain moments, it could become a matter of imperial policy. Imagine standing inside a church where the walls seem strangely bare. The air smells of wax and incense. A priest speaks quietly. The faithful gather. But everyone knows that the question of sacred images has become much larger than the walls of this church. It is connected to the emperor. It is connected to bishops. It is connected to monasteries. It is connected to soldiers and officials. And perhaps the empress has her own position. She must decide how openly to express it. Her choice could affect her reputation. It could affect her family. It could affect her relationship with the emperor. It could even affect her political survival. For an ordinary believer, disagreement might remain inside a local community. For an empress, disagreement could become imperial policy. And this brings us back to one of the central contradictions of palace life. The empress could be extremely powerful, but her power existed within a structure that was constantly moving. She could influence the emperor, but the emperor could ignore her. She could influence officials. But officials could organize against her. She could protect relatives. But those relatives could become liabilities. She could support a religious cause. But that cause could become politically dangerous. She could secure her son's succession. But her son might later turn against her. There was no simple formula for safety. Perhaps this is why so many Byzantine imperial stories feel like stories of uncertainty. The palace could be beautiful in the morning. It could be tense by evening. And sometimes the change came from something as simple as a messenger arriving through a door, a letter from a general, a report from a distant province, news of a rebellion, news of an illness, news that someone had died, news that someone had declared himself emperor. The empress might hear the message while surrounded by marble, silk, and gold. But the message itself could change everything. And so the palace remained both magnificent and fragile. Its walls could survive earthquakes. Its ceremonies could survive generations. Its traditions could stretch back to the Roman past. Yet the lives of the people inside could turn in a single afternoon. As evening approaches, Constantinople begins to soften. The noise of the markets gradually fades. The light over the water becomes pale. Small lamps appear in windows. The smell of cooking drifts through the neighborhoods. Inside the palace, another day is ending. The empress may finally have a few quiet moments. Perhaps she sits beside a window. Perhaps she speaks with one trusted companion. Perhaps she reads or prays. Perhaps she thinks about her children. Perhaps she thinks about the emperor. Perhaps she thinks about the future. The palace is quieter now. But it is never completely silent. There are footsteps in the corridors. There are guards at doors. There are servants preparing for the night. Somewhere, a lamp flickers. And beyond the palace, the city continues to breathe. For a moment, the empress is simply a woman sitting in the evening. Not a symbol. Not a political faction. Not the mother of an heir. Not the wife of an emperor. Just a human being in a vast city, listening to the sounds of night. Yet tomorrow will bring another set of expectations. Another ceremony. Another conversation. Another decision. And perhaps another reminder that the most beautiful palace in the medieval world could also be one of the loneliest places to live. The night deepens over Constantinople. The water grows dark beneath the moon. The last sounds of the city become distant. And somewhere inside the imperial residence, the empress prepares to sleep. For a few hours at least, the politics of the empire can wait. But morning will come again. And when it does, the crown will still be there. Night has settled over Constantinople. The waters of the Bosporus are dark, and the lamps along the city have become small points of light. Within the imperial palace, servants move quietly through corridors, preparing rooms for the night. The empress may finally have some privacy. But privacy at the Byzantine court was never quite the same as privacy today. Her household was large. Attendants could be nearby. Guards protected important entrances. Servants carried messages. Officials might need access at unexpected hours. The empress could close a door, but the world of the palace remained close on the other side. And when morning returned, she would once again become part of the machinery of imperial life. This time, let us follow her through one of the less glamorous parts of that life. Clothing. At first, clothing might sound like a pleasant subject. After all, imperial women could wear beautiful garments. Silk was highly valued. Fine embroidery could display wealth. Jewelry could show rank. Gold and precious stones could catch the light during ceremonies. But beauty came with responsibility. An empress could not simply wear whatever she liked whenever she wished. Clothing communicated social position. The colors, fabrics, jewelry, and style of dress could all carry meaning. The imperial court had rules and traditions surrounding appearance. An empress was expected to look like an empress. Imagine waking before sunrise while attendants prepare your clothing. The room is cool. A small fire provides some warmth. The fabric waiting for you is heavy and carefully made. Someone adjusts a fastening. Someone arranges your hair. Someone checks the jewelry. There is little privacy. Your body has become part of the ceremony. The way you look will be noticed. If you appear too plain, perhaps someone will comment. If you appear too extravagant on the wrong occasion, perhaps someone will comment. If your clothing is not suitable for a religious ceremony, someone will notice. If a political visitor arrives, the presentation may matter. The empress, therefore, has to dress not only for comfort, but for meaning. And clothing could be physically uncomfortable. Fine garments could be layered. Jewelry could be heavy. Ceremonial clothing was not necessarily designed for easy movement. A woman might spend long periods standing or sitting in formal surroundings. She had to remain composed. She could not simply loosen everything and relax whenever she wished. The palace might be luxurious, but luxury itself could become a form of work. This is an important idea when thinking about imperial women. The rich and powerful often had access to things that made life materially easier. They had better food, better housing, more servants, better clothing, more protection from certain kinds of physical hardship. But status creates its own demands. The higher a person stood, the more visible that person became. And the more visible a person became, the less freedom there was to behave casually. For an empress, even her body could become political. Her appearance communicated the prosperity of the dynasty. Her jewelry demonstrated wealth. Her composure demonstrated dignity. Her religious clothing could demonstrate piety. Her physical presence beside the emperor reinforced the image of a stable imperial household. So she had to perform, not like an actor pretending to be someone else. Rather, she had to perform the social role that everyone expected her to occupy. This idea of performance is especially important in Byzantine court culture. Ceremonies were carefully organized. The imperial couple could appear in public at particular times. They might participate in religious festivals. They might receive ambassadors. They might attend processions. They might appear at the hippodrome. They might visit churches. The public did not see every private moment. It saw selected moments. Those moments helped create the image of imperial authority, and the empress was part of that image. Sometimes she could be shown beside the emperor in monumental art. Mosaics and other surviving works remind us that imperial women were important enough to be represented in sacred and political spaces. The famous mosaics of Empress Theodora at San Vitale in Ravenna, for example, present her in magnificent clothing, surrounded by members of her court. The image is carefully arranged. Every detail communicates status: the jewelry, the garments, the attendants, the halo, the position of the empress. The entire composition tells the viewer that this is not an ordinary woman. She belongs to the imperial world. Yet there is something else hidden inside such an image. The mosaic shows us the public version of Theodora. It does not show us her tired mornings. It does not show us private arguments. It does not show us illness. It does not show us uncertainty. Art shows what the court wanted people to see. History often asks us to look beyond that surface. This becomes especially interesting when we consider Emperor Justinian and Empress Theodora. Theodora's rise was remarkable. She did not come from the traditional aristocratic background that might have been expected of an imperial bride. Her early life was connected with the world of Constantinople's entertainment culture. She eventually became the wife of Justinian. When Justinian became emperor in 527, Theodora became empress. She then became one of the most influential women in Byzantine history. Her story demonstrates that the imperial court could sometimes allow extraordinary social mobility, but it also shows how dangerous reputation could be. Later writers presented very different images of Theodora. Some praised her. Some condemned her. Some accounts describe her as deeply influential in government. Others focus on scandalous stories about her early life. The most famous hostile source is Procopius, whose secret history contains sensational accusations about Theodora. Historians have long debated how much of those stories can be trusted. This is an important reminder. An empress could be remembered according to the interests and prejudices of the writers who described her. Theodora's example shows that women at court were not simply judged by what they did. They were also judged by who they had been. Her past could be used against her. Her power could be used against her. Her influence over Justinian could be used against her. And her decisions could be interpreted through assumptions about women and authority. This is where the life of an empress could become particularly unfair. If she was politically active, some critics could portray her as interfering. If she remained quiet, others could call her weak. If she supported relatives, she could be accused of favoritism. If she supported religious causes, opponents might accuse her of fanaticism. If she resisted the emperor, she could appear disloyal. If she agreed with him, she might be portrayed as merely following orders. There was always another interpretation available. The palace was full of people watching, and historians centuries later would continue watching too. Now imagine another ordinary part of imperial life: food. An empress could dine far better than most people in the empire. The imperial household had access to a wide range of ingredients: bread, vegetables, fruits, fish, meat, wine, spices, oils, and other foods could be obtained through the empire's vast networks. Constantinople was a major commercial center. Ships arrived with goods. Merchants traveled long distances. The imperial court had access to supplies from many regions. But meals at court were not simply about eating. They were also ceremonial. Who sat where could matter. Who served the food could matter. What was served could communicate wealth. Who was invited could matter. A banquet could be a political occasion. An ambassador could be impressed by imperial hospitality. A powerful official could be honored. A marriage could be celebrated. A religious feast could be observed. Imagine sitting at a long table while servants move carefully around you. The smell of roasted meat fills the room. Fresh bread is broken. Wine is poured. Candles flicker. Music may be heard in the distance. Conversation remains controlled. You cannot simply forget where you are. The person sitting nearby may command an army. Another may control an important office. Another may be connected to a rival family. Even dinner can become politics. And then there were religious expectations. The Byzantine calendar was filled with religious festivals and periods of fasting. Christian fasting practices affected the foods people ate at particular times. An empress, like other devout members of society, could be expected to observe religious customs. This could mean changing the diet at certain periods. For someone in the imperial household, fasting could also be part of public religious identity. The empress's piety was visible. Her participation in religious observances could strengthen her reputation. But again, the palace did not allow simple, private devotion. Everything could be observed. A woman who appeared extremely devout might gain admiration. A woman who seemed insufficiently devout could face criticism. And religious disagreements could be even more serious. The Byzantine Empire experienced deep theological conflicts. People could disagree about doctrine, worship, sacred images, and the relationship between church and state. An empress could become involved in these disputes. Sometimes her influence could help change imperial policy. Sometimes her position could make her a target. Consider Empress Pulcheria. She lived in the 5th century and became one of the most influential women in the imperial court. Pulcheria was the sister of Emperor Theodosius II. She became regent while he was young, and later continued to exercise major influence. She also developed a strong religious identity and was associated with virginity and devotion. Her political life shows that an imperial woman did not necessarily need marriage to become powerful. She could exercise authority through family, religion, and court politics. But Pulcheria's position also illustrates another challenge. Imperial women could become central to succession disputes. Who would marry whom? Who would produce heirs? Which family would gain influence? Which religious position would the court support? An empress or imperial princess could be at the center of these questions. Marriage could therefore be both opportunity and constraint. Some imperial women married powerful men. Others avoided marriage. Some entered religious life. Some were married for political reasons. And sometimes, a woman who had been married could later be forced to abandon that life. This brings us to one of the most difficult realities of imperial womanhood. A woman might not control her own future. In the medieval world, marriage was often influenced by families. At the imperial court, the stakes were even higher. A marriage could affect succession. A marriage could affect alliances. A marriage could affect the balance between aristocratic families. A marriage could affect foreign relations. Therefore, an imperial woman's romantic preferences were not always the most important consideration. Her political value could matter more. Imagine being told that you will marry someone because the empire needs the connection. You may never have met him. You may know almost nothing about his personality, but the decision has already been made. There will be ceremonies. There will be gifts. There will be public celebrations. People will praise the union. And everyone will call it fortunate. Yet the person who has to live inside the marriage may have had the least influence over the decision. This is why the phrase, "it sucks to be an empress," needs some explanation. It does not mean that every empress lived a miserable life. That would be historically inaccurate. Some probably enjoyed great comfort. Some had loving relationships. Some possessed extraordinary authority. Some had meaningful religious lives. Some were highly respected. Some lived long and secure lives. The difficulty lies in the structure of the position. The crown gave a woman enormous privilege. But it also tied her to expectations that ordinary people did not face. She could not easily disappear. She could not simply abandon politics. She could not always choose her marriage. She could not guarantee the safety of her children. And she could not assume that today's allies would remain tomorrow's allies. The higher she rose, the more consequences her decisions could have. This was particularly true when the empire faced war. The Byzantine Empire spent centuries dealing with military threats. Enemies changed over time. Persians, Arab armies, Slavic peoples, Bulgars, Rus, Normans, Turks, and other powers all appeared in different periods and circumstances. The empire's borders were never permanently secure. When an army approached, the palace felt the consequences. A military defeat could weaken an emperor. A victory could strengthen him. A failed campaign could create political criticism. An empress might not personally command soldiers, but she could still become involved in the consequences. Her husband could be away for months. Her sons could be sent to war. Her relatives could command armies. News from the frontier could determine what happened at court. Imagine the palace waiting for a military report. Days pass. Then weeks. A messenger finally arrives. The guards open the gate. The message is carried inside. Everyone wants to know what it says. Perhaps the army has won. Perhaps it has lost. Perhaps the emperor is safe. Perhaps he is injured. Perhaps a city has fallen. Perhaps a general has rebelled. Until the message is understood, the palace is suspended between possibilities. An empress might experience this waiting again and again. War did not need to be visible to affect her. Its consequences could enter the palace as letters, rumors, wounded soldiers, refugees, and political arguments. And sometimes the emperor himself might be away. An imperial wife left behind in Constantinople could become the visible center of the court. She might oversee household affairs. She might receive information. She might influence officials. She might pray for the army. She might care for children. She might wait. Waiting was an important part of imperial life. Modern people often imagine power as constant action. But rulers spent enormous amounts of time waiting for information. A letter from a province, a ship from another city, a messenger from the army, a decision from a bishop, a response from a foreign ruler. The empire moved at the speed of horses, ships, and human voices. An empress could therefore spend long periods knowing that something important was happening somewhere far away, without knowing exactly what. That uncertainty could be exhausting. And then there was illness. The imperial household was not protected from disease. The Byzantine Empire experienced major epidemics. The most famous was the plague that struck during the reign of Justinian in the 6th century. The Justinianic plague affected Constantinople and many other parts of the Mediterranean world. People became sick. Deaths increased. The city was overwhelmed. The imperial household itself had to confront the disease. Justinian became ill, but survived. Theodora remained an important figure during this period. Imagine the city during such an outbreak. The normal sounds of commerce become quieter. People become afraid of crowded spaces. Funeral activity increases. The smell of smoke and burial preparations can linger. Messages arrive from different districts. Everyone knows someone who has become sick. Even an empress cannot command a disease to disappear. This is another reminder that imperial power had limits. The palace could provide protection. It could provide better food. It could provide servants. It could provide physicians. But nature did not recognize rank. A fever could enter a palace as easily as a poor neighborhood. And when disease affected the empire, the empress might have to deal with grief on a scale that was difficult to comprehend. Family members could die. Officials could die. Servants could die. Soldiers could die. Cities could suffer. The imperial court had to continue functioning even while ordinary life was breaking apart. For an empress, this could mean balancing compassion, religion, family, and political responsibility. Perhaps she would support charitable efforts. Perhaps she would help religious institutions. Perhaps she would retreat into prayer. Perhaps she would simply endure. Historical sources rarely tell us exactly what ordinary imperial women felt during such disasters. But we can understand the basic human reality. A palace cannot make grief disappear. Gold cannot replace a lost child. A crown cannot make illness less frightening. And a throne cannot make uncertainty easier. As the plague years pass, the city gradually changes. Markets return. Ships appear again. People rebuild. The imperial household continues, and the empress moves forward. This was another skill required of rulers. Continuing. The palace could experience tragedy one year and celebration the next. A funeral could be followed by a coronation. A defeat could be followed by a wedding. A religious dispute could be followed by a festival. Life continued because empires had to continue. The empress therefore learned to carry personal feelings inside public rituals. Perhaps she was grieving, yet she still had to appear at the ceremony. Perhaps she was frightened, yet she still had to smile when receiving an ambassador. Perhaps she was angry, yet she still had to maintain dignity. Perhaps she was exhausted. Yet the schedule continued. There is something deeply human in that. Even the most powerful people have days when they would rather stay in bed. But an empress could not always do that. The palace needed her. The dynasty needed her. The ceremony needed her. And sometimes the empire itself needed her. As evening returns to Constantinople, the palace grows quieter. The day's clothing is removed. Jewelry is placed away. Servants prepare lamps. The smells of dinner slowly fade. Outside, the city is settling into night. The empress may finally sit without an audience. Perhaps she looks through a window toward the dark water. Across the Bosporus, Another shore is barely visible. Beyond it lie provinces, armies, monasteries, villages, ports, mountains, and distant frontiers. All of them belong to the enormous world over which the emperor claims authority. And she is part of that world. She may never see most of it. She may never know the names of most of the people whose lives are affected by decisions made inside the palace. But she carries the weight of the imperial household. Her marriage matters. Her children matter. Her faith matters. Her relatives matter. Her reputation matters. And tomorrow, all of these things will matter again. For now, the night is calm. A lamp burns softly. The palace walls hold the day's warmth. The city murmurs in the distance. The Bosporus moves quietly beneath the moon. And the Empress rests, knowing that power has never guaranteed peace. When morning comes, another decision will be waiting. Perhaps it will concern her family. Perhaps the church. Perhaps a marriage. Perhaps an army. Perhaps nothing more than a ceremony. But somewhere beyond the palace walls, history is already moving, and the woman at the center of it will have to move with it. The night has passed quietly over Constantinople. A pale light is beginning to appear beyond the rooftops, and the first sounds of morning are returning to the city. A boat moves across the Bosporus. A baker prepares his oven. A few early travelers make their way through the streets. Inside the palace, the servants are already awake. For the Empress, another day begins. But today, let us stay a little longer inside the private world of the imperial household. Because one of the strangest things about being an empress was that almost everything around you was larger than ordinary life. The rooms were larger. The ceremonies were larger. The meals could be larger. The religious processions could be larger. The expectations were larger. Even family problems could become affairs of state. Imagine having a disagreement with your husband. For most people, it might remain between two people. But if your husband is the emperor, the disagreement can have consequences far beyond the marriage. Suppose the emperor favors one group of officials while you trust another. Suppose he wants to appoint a particular relative while you believe that person is dangerous. Suppose you support a religious position that he dislikes. Suppose you believe your son should have a greater role in government. The argument may begin privately, but the people around you will notice. Servants notice. Officials notice. Relatives notice. And once people notice, they begin to interpret. They may wonder who has more influence. They may wonder whether the emperor is listening to his wife. They may wonder whether the empress has become too powerful. The marriage itself becomes part of political conversation. This is why an imperial marriage could be complicated in ways that are difficult to imagine today. Love might exist. Affection might exist. Respect might exist. But the marriage also had a public function. The emperor and empress represented the imperial household. Their relationship could affect the appearance of stability. A visible disagreement could create rumors. A public agreement could reassure people. A shared religious appearance could communicate unity. The couple, therefore, had reasons to maintain a public image of harmony, even when private life was more complicated. This was especially important because Byzantine political culture valued the idea of order. The empire was supposed to have a ruler. The ruler was supposed to have a household. The household was supposed to appear disciplined, and the empress was part of that discipline. Yet an empress was not simply expected to obey. The historical record shows that imperial women could advise, persuade, negotiate, and sometimes oppose their husbands. Theodora's relationship with Justinian is an important example. During the Nika Revolt of 532, Constantinople descended into serious violence. The factions of the Hippodrome had become involved in unrest, and large parts of the city were affected. The imperial government faced a dangerous moment. Justinian considered leaving the city. According to Procopius, Theodora argued strongly against abandoning the throne. Her famous speech is preserved in ancient writing, although historians naturally treat the exact wording with caution. What matters is that Theodora was remembered as a woman who encouraged the emperor to remain. The revolt was eventually suppressed, with terrible loss of life. The episode became one of the defining moments of Justinian's reign, and it demonstrates something important. An empress could influence decisions during a political crisis, but that influence also meant responsibility. If the decision had gone differently, Theodora might have been remembered very differently. This is one of the difficult features of historical power. When a woman has little authority, historians may say she was powerless. When she has great authority, historians may blame her for the consequences. There is rarely a comfortable middle ground. The same pattern appears in other periods of Byzantine history. Women who became involved in succession disputes could be accused of ambition. Women who supported religious reforms could be accused of fanaticism. Women who protected their children could be accused of selfishness. Women who supported relatives could be accused of nepotism. The political world was filled with judgments, and the empress had to live with them. Now imagine walking through the palace after a major political crisis. The corridors look the same. The marble still shines. The lamps still burn. But you know that people have died. You know that the city has suffered. You know that someone who was an ally yesterday might become an enemy tomorrow. The palace may feel strangely quiet. This was one of the emotional burdens of imperial life. The ruler had to continue. There was no simple way to pause the empire because the people inside the palace were frightened. Governments still needed decisions. Armies still needed supplies. Diplomats still needed answers. Religious ceremonies still occurred. Taxes still had to be collected. Messages still had to be sent. The imperial machine continued moving, and the empress moved with it. One part of her life that deserves more attention is motherhood. Being the mother of an imperial child could bring enormous prestige. But it could also bring enormous anxiety. The survival of a dynasty depended heavily on children. A healthy son could strengthen the succession. A sick child could create uncertainty. A young emperor could require a regent. A daughter could become part of a diplomatic marriage. Children were therefore never entirely private. They were members of the dynasty from the moment they were born. Imagine an imperial nursery. The air is warm. A small fire burns nearby. Attendants move carefully. A child sleeps. Outside the room, the palace continues its political life. Officials discuss government. Soldiers guard the entrances. Servants carry messages. But inside, the Empress may be thinking only about whether her child is breathing comfortably. This contrast between the enormous political world and the small world of motherhood must have been profound. A child is still a child. A mother can still worry. No title removes that. And if the child becomes ill, the Empress cannot simply order the illness away. She may call physicians. She may pray. She may seek religious assistance. She may wait. Waiting again. The imperial household had many forms of waiting. Waiting for an army. Waiting for a messenger. Waiting for a birth. Waiting for a physician. Waiting for a political decision. Waiting to see which faction would prevail. The palace was full of people who could afford beautiful furniture, but could not control the future. This is why the emotional life of an empress must have included uncertainty. A mother might know that her child's future could involve enormous power. She might also know that power could make the child a target. The history of Byzantine succession contains many examples of rulers being removed, exiled, imprisoned, or killed. The imperial family was not always a safe family. Sometimes, the greatest danger came from relatives. An uncle could become a rival. A cousin could become a claimant. A son could become an opponent. A brother could organize supporters. This is difficult to understand from a modern perspective because we often imagine family as the safest place. At the Byzantine court, family was also political territory. Blood relationships could create loyalty, but they could also create competing claims. If two people were related to the imperial family, both might believe they had a legitimate path to power. And once that happened, the family itself could become divided. An empress caught between relatives might face impossible choices. Whom should she support? Her husband? Her son? Her brother? Her father? Her own political survival? There might be no decision that kept everyone happy. And sometimes, there was no decision that kept everyone alive. This is one reason imperial women could develop powerful networks of their own. The women of the palace were not isolated. They could have attendants, relatives, ladies of the household, eunuch officials, religious contacts, and other trusted people around them. Eunuchs, in particular, could hold important positions in the Byzantine court. Some served as chamberlains and high-ranking officials. Their access to the imperial household could make them politically influential. An empress might therefore have to understand the relationships among people who served her directly. The palace was not simply divided into men outside and women inside. Its political world crossed those boundaries. Women could influence men. Men could influence women. Eunuchs could become powerful intermediaries. Relatives could become political actors. Religious figures could gain access to the imperial household. The court was a network, and the empress was one of its central nodes. This could be useful. It could also be dangerous. A trusted servant might become essential. But if that servant later changed sides, the betrayal could be devastating. The closer someone was to the empress, the more valuable information that person might possess. In a palace where information was power, intimacy itself could become political. Imagine whispering a private concern to someone you trust. You believe the conversation will remain private. But the next day, Another official seems to know about it. Perhaps the information traveled. Perhaps someone guessed. Perhaps someone deliberately passed it along. You may never know. That uncertainty could make trust difficult, and yet trust was necessary. No one could manage an imperial household entirely alone. An empress needed attendants. She needed people to manage clothing, people to organize meals, people to carry messages, people to arrange ceremonies, people to help with children, people to manage estates and finances, people to accompany her during religious activities. The more people involved, the more complicated the household became. But the imperial household was also a place where women could have economic influence. An empress could possess property. She could control wealth. She could make donations. She could support institutions. She could manage estates through administrators. This is important because the medieval world did not completely exclude elite women from economic activity. The reality was more complicated. Women of wealth could possess property under certain legal circumstances. Widows could sometimes exercise significant control over resources. Imperial women could be especially wealthy. Their wealth gave them tools for influence. Money could support charitable works. Money could support monasteries. Money could support relatives. Money could also help secure loyalty. But wealth could create suspicion. If an empress accumulated too much independent influence, opponents might become nervous. They might fear that her household was becoming a separate political center, and that could be dangerous. An empress, therefore, had to balance generosity and restraint. This balance appears repeatedly in Byzantine history. Charity was admirable. Excessive favoritism was suspicious. Religious patronage was admirable. Using religious institutions for political purposes could be criticized. Supporting family was natural. Building a family faction could be dangerous. The same action could look virtuous or threatening depending on who was watching. This was especially true for powerful women. The standards were not always equal. A powerful man might be praised as decisive. A powerful woman might be called domineering. A man who built a network of supporters might be considered an effective politician. A woman doing the same could be accused of scheming. The sources of the period were shaped by the assumptions of their writers. So when we read about an ambitious empress, we have to ask what the writer expected a woman to be. Quiet? Modest? Religious? Charitable? Submissive? If a woman stepped beyond those expectations, the description could become harsh. But women did step beyond them. Again and again, some governed. Some negotiated. Some defended their children. Some supported religious movements. Some shaped architecture and charitable institutions. Some survived changes of dynasty. Some even ruled as sovereigns. The Byzantine world was therefore more complicated than a simple story of male rulers and powerless women. But complexity does not mean equality. An empress could possess enormous authority while still living under expectations that were different from those placed on men. This becomes especially visible when we think about aging. The palace valued youth in ways that were not unusual for medieval societies. An imperial bride might be chosen partly because she could produce children. As she aged, her role could change. Once she was no longer a young bride, she might become a mother-in-law, a widow, a grandmother, a senior member of the dynasty. Her influence could continue, but it might take a different form. An older empress could possess experience that younger rulers lacked. She might remember previous political crises. She might know which families could be trusted. She might understand court ceremony. She might have connections with religious institutions. She could become an important advisor. But age could also mean losing the central role she once had. A new emperor might have a new wife. A new generation could arrive. The palace could move on. For a woman who had once stood at the center of imperial attention, this transition could be difficult. Imagine the same palace years later. The halls are familiar. The stone floors are familiar. The gardens are familiar. But the people are different. The young attendants you once knew have grown older. New servants have arrived. Your children are adults. Perhaps one of them is now emperor. Perhaps another has been sent away. Perhaps a daughter has married a foreign ruler. The palace continues. You have changed. The empire has changed. But the ceremonies remain. This could be both comforting and melancholy. Imperial traditions gave continuity, but they could also make personal change feel very visible. The empire was ancient. An individual life was short. The palace could make that contrast impossible to ignore. A woman might enter as a young bride and eventually become a grandmother, surrounded by people who had been born after she first arrived. The walls had witnessed her entire adult life. Perhaps that was one of the quietest burdens of all. The palace remembered, even when people did not. As evening approaches again, the sounds of Constantinople soften. The city has been busy all day. Now the markets begin to close. Merchants count their money. Workers return home. The smell of cooking fills the neighborhoods. Church lamps glow. The sea breeze moves through the streets. Inside the palace, the empress prepares for another evening. Maybe there has been no crisis today. No rebellion. No war. No death. Only ordinary responsibilities. A meeting, a prayer, a meal, a letter, a conversation with a relative, a visit from an official. Perhaps that is enough. History does not need a disaster every day. For most people, including emperors and empresses, life was made mostly of ordinary moments. And those ordinary moments were where the palace became a home. A complicated home, a beautiful home, a heavily guarded home, a home where the woman at the center could possess extraordinary privilege while still feeling trapped by the expectations surrounding her. She could look out from a high window and see one of the greatest cities in the medieval world. She could own treasures beyond the imagination of ordinary people. She could command attention from powerful men. And yet she might not be free to choose her own marriage. She might not be free from political suspicion. She might not be able to protect her children. She might not know whether the people closest to her were truly loyal. The contradiction remains. The crown could open doors. It could also close them. Night returns. The palace grows still. The empress's attendants withdraw. A final lamp burns in a quiet room. Perhaps she prays before sleep. Perhaps she thinks of tomorrow. Perhaps she remembers someone who is no longer alive. Perhaps she worries about a child. Perhaps she simply closes her eyes. Outside, Constantinople sleeps beneath the stars. The empire is still there. The walls still stand. Ships rest in the harbor. The Bosporus continues its slow movement between continents. For this one night, there is no ceremony, no ambassador, no succession dispute, no political argument, only darkness and quiet. But the peace will not last forever. Because the Byzantine court was built on change, emperors died, dynasties shifted, children became rulers, generals became rivals, religious disputes returned, foreign armies appeared, and empresses were forced to adapt. Some survived by remaining quiet. Some survived by building alliances. Some survived through their children. Some used religion. Some used wealth. Some used political intelligence. And some simply endured. The morning will come again. When it does, the empress will rise. Her attendants will return. The clothing will be prepared. The doors will open. The palace will begin to move. And once again, the woman behind the crown will step into the world that expects everything from her. The city outside will see an empress. But behind the silk, the gold, and the ceremony, there will still be a human being trying to find a little space to breathe. And perhaps that is where we should leave her tonight. Not in the middle of a battle, not during a rebellion, not beneath a shining crown, but in the quiet hour before dawn, when the palace is still and the city has not yet awakened. For a few moments, she is simply herself. Then, somewhere beyond the walls, the first bird calls. A servant quietly opens a door. Morning is coming, and the empire waits. The first light of morning returns to Constantinople. For the last time, we enter the quiet world of the Imperial Palace. The city is beginning to stir. The Bosporus catches the early light. Ships move slowly through the water. Bakers prepare their ovens. Street vendors begin arranging their goods. Churches wait for the first prayers of the day. And inside the palace, the empress is waking. Perhaps she has slept well. Perhaps she has not. Perhaps she spent part of the night thinking about her family. Perhaps she was worried about a letter that arrived yesterday. Perhaps she is simply tired. Whatever happened during the night, the morning does not ask whether she is ready. The palace continues. A servant enters. Clothing is prepared. Hair is arranged. Breakfast is brought. A religious observance may be approaching. Someone may be waiting for an audience. Another message may already be on its way. The empress rises, and once again, the private woman becomes the public figure. This has been the central contradiction of her life. She has lived in extraordinary comfort. She has lived close to the center of one of the most remarkable political worlds of the medieval age. She may have possessed wealth that most people could barely imagine. She may have been surrounded by silk, gold, marble, incense, music, gardens, servants, and ceremony. Yet comfort did not mean control. Her marriage could be political. Her children could be political. Her family could be political. Her religion could be political. Her appearance could be political. Her friendships could be political. Even her grief could become part of the public story. That is why the life of an empress can seem so strange when viewed from the modern world. The palace offered almost everything that material wealth could provide. But it could not provide certainty. And certainty was something imperial women often needed most. The Byzantine Empire survived for centuries, partly because its institutions could adapt. Dynasties changed, languages changed, borders changed, enemies changed, religious controversies came and went, cities grew and declined. But the imperial court continued to preserve a sense of Roman tradition. The empress was part of that continuity. She connected the emperor with family. She connected the palace with religion. She connected the present with the future. And sometimes she connected one dynasty with another. This is why the role mattered. But it is also why the role could be so difficult. The more important the empress became, the more people had reasons to watch her. A woman with no political importance could disappear into ordinary life. An empress could not. Her name was known. Her family was known. Her children were known. Her decisions could be remembered for generations. The most powerful empresses therefore faced a strange problem. They had to be strong enough to survive politics. But they could not always appear too powerful. They had to influence the emperor without appearing to control him. They had to defend their children without appearing selfish. They had to help their relatives without appearing corrupt. They had to show religious devotion without allowing religious disputes to destroy their political position. They had to display wealth without appearing wasteful. They had to display humility without appearing weak. The balance was almost impossible. And perhaps that is why the Byzantine court produced so many stories about women who were described as unusually clever, ambitious, pious, dangerous, generous, or ruthless. The court demanded strong personalities. Then it sometimes punished them for being strong. Consider again the famous women we have encountered: Pulcheria, Theodora, Irene. Theodora of the 11th century, Zoe. Each lived in a different political world. Each had different circumstances. Each used different forms of influence. And none can be reduced to a simple stereotype. Pulcheria used family position and religious authority. Theodora became a powerful partner in Justinian's reign. Irene moved from regency to sole rule. Zoe became central to imperial succession. Theodora eventually ruled in her own name. Their stories remind us that Byzantine women could occupy the highest levels of power, but their stories also remind us that power was never simple. Irene's rise to sole rule came through a brutal succession conflict involving her son. Theodora's political position was connected to a complicated imperial family. Zoe's life was shaped by marriages, succession, and court politics. These women were powerful, but they lived inside a system where power could be dangerous. An emperor who lost support might be removed. A general who became too ambitious might rebel. A relative who became too influential might be feared. An empress who became too independent could face opposition. The palace was therefore a place where everyone had to understand limits, even the emperor, even the empress. The Roman imperial tradition gave the ruler immense prestige, but the ruler still needed soldiers. The ruler still needed officials. The ruler still needed money. The ruler still needed religious legitimacy. The ruler still needed the support of important parts of society. Power was not simply sitting on a throne. It was maintaining relationships. For an empress, this was often even more complicated. She had to understand the people around her, while also protecting her own position. And sometimes, the best strategy was patience. waiting, listening, letting someone else speak first, allowing a political opponent to reveal their intentions. This kind of patience is easy to overlook because history tends to celebrate dramatic actions. But survival can be quiet. A woman who survived for decades in a dangerous court had accomplished something significant, even if no historian wrote a dramatic story about every day of her life. The ability to endure mattered. Imagine an older empress sitting quietly while younger officials argue. She has seen this before. She knows that political enthusiasm can disappear quickly. She knows that today's favorite can become tomorrow's enemy. She knows that an emperor's promise is not always permanent. She knows that rumors can grow. She knows that armies can change sides. She has learned something that cannot be taught in a book. Wait. Listen. Watch. Then act. Perhaps this was one of the greatest skills an imperial woman could possess. Not simply courage, not simply beauty, not simply wealth, but judgment. Knowing when to speak, knowing when to remain silent, knowing whom to trust, knowing when a gift was really a political request, knowing when a marriage was really an alliance, knowing when a religious argument was about faith and when it was also about power, knowing when to remain in the palace, and knowing when the safest place might be a monastery. Monastic life deserves one final look. For some imperial women, retirement to a monastery was forced by political circumstances. For others, religious life could be chosen or embraced later in life. The Byzantine world had many monasteries. They were places of prayer, study, charity, and community. An aristocratic or imperial woman entering such a world might leave behind the ceremonies of court. The change could be enormous. The noise of politics would become quieter. The clothing would become simpler. The daily rhythm would revolve around prayer and work. Instead of waiting for ambassadors, she might wait for the next service. Instead of discussing succession, she might read religious texts. Instead of jewels, there might be icons and simple objects of devotion. For someone who had spent years inside the imperial palace, the simplicity could feel like a relief. For someone forced into the monastery, it could feel like exile. The same place could therefore mean different things to different women. This is important. We should not imagine every imperial woman as a prisoner, nor should we imagine every imperial woman as a privileged queen living without problems. The truth is more interesting. She could be both privileged and constrained. She could be powerful and vulnerable. She could be respected and criticized. She could be wealthy and anxious. She could command servants and still have little control over her own political future. Human lives rarely fit neatly into one category, and the Byzantine Empress is a perfect example. Now imagine leaving the palace for a moment. Walk through Constantinople. The streets are busy. You hear people speaking. You smell bread, fish, smoke, animals and spices. Merchants call to customers. Children move through narrow streets. Workers carry heavy loads. Priests walk toward churches. Sailors arrive from distant places. Most people will never enter the imperial palace. Most will never see the empress closely. Yet her life is connected to theirs. The taxes collected by the state help support the government. The armies protecting the borders depend on imperial decisions. Religious foundations supported by the court affect local communities. Imperial ceremonies help define the political identity of the city. The empress is therefore separated from ordinary people by enormous social distance. But she is also part of the same world. She eats, she sleeps, she becomes sick, she worries. She loses people she loves, she grows older, she experiences grief. The palace cannot change those basic human facts. Perhaps that is the most useful way to understand her. Not as a perfect woman surrounded by gold, not as a helpless victim, not as a legendary schemer, but as a human being placed inside an extraordinary institution. The institution demanded that she become something larger than herself. The empire needed an empress. So she became one. And once she wore the title, the role followed her everywhere. When she entered a church, she was the empress. When she sat beside the emperor, she was the empress. When she gave birth to a child, she was the mother of the dynasty. When she lost a husband, she was the imperial widow. When she advised a ruler, she was a political figure. When she entered a monastery, she could still be remembered as an imperial woman. There was almost no escape from the title. That is perhaps the deepest reason why being an empress could be difficult. The person and the position were never completely separate, and the position could survive long after the person wanted to be left alone. Think of the palace itself. The buildings have changed. Many structures that once stood have disappeared. Earthquakes, fires, rebuilding, warfare, and centuries of change transformed Constantinople. The Byzantine Empire eventually ended in 1453, when the city fell to the Ottoman forces of Mehmed II. The imperial court disappeared. The last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI, died during the final defense of the city. The long Roman story of Constantinople came to an end. But the memory of the empire remained, and the women who had lived within its palaces remained part of that memory. Some are remembered vividly, some are barely known, some became symbols, some became controversial figures, some became saints in the Christian tradition, some became political examples, others survived only in a few lines of historical writing. Their physical world is mostly gone. But their stories remain. When we think about the Byzantine Empire today, it is easy to picture domes, mosaics, golden backgrounds, imperial robes, and magnificent churches. Those images are beautiful, and they are real. But behind them were people. People who had ordinary fears. People who became sick, people who argued, people who loved, people who lost children, people who worried about their futures, people who tried to survive politics. The empress belonged to that human world. She simply lived at its highest level, and living at the highest level did not make life simple. It made everything more visible. A mistake could become a scandal. A marriage could become an alliance. A child could become an heir. A widowhood could become a succession crisis. A religious opinion could become imperial policy. A family member could become a political threat. And a single decision could echo for generations. Perhaps this is why the phrase, "It sucks to be an empress," works as a starting point, even though the reality was more complicated. It sucked because the privileges came with conditions. The silk came with ceremony. The gold came with expectations. The palace came with surveillance. The crown came with responsibility. The family came with politics. The children came with succession. The marriage came with diplomacy. And power came with danger. But there was another side. Being an empress could also mean having opportunities that almost no other woman in the empire possessed. She could influence laws and policies. She could support religious institutions. She could help the poor. She could protect family members. She could shape architecture. She could influence imperial decisions. She could sometimes act as regent, and in rare circumstances, she could rule the empire herself. That matters. We should not turn these women into helpless figures simply because their lives were constrained. They were capable political actors. They made choices. They built alliances. They negotiated. They resisted. They adapted. Some failed. Some succeeded. Some left extraordinary legacies. The Byzantine world was not a place where women had no influence. It was a place where female influence often operated through complicated channels: marriage, motherhood, religion, family, wealth, patronage, court relationships, and sometimes direct political authority. The empress could use all of these, but she also had to live with their risks. The sun is now rising over Constantinople. The city is bright. The Bosporus shines beneath the morning light. The palace walls are warm. The streets are filling again. Centuries ago, an empress might have stood somewhere here. Perhaps she looked through a window toward the water. Perhaps she listened to church bells. Perhaps she watched ships entering the harbor. Perhaps she wondered what would happen to her children. Perhaps she worried about the emperor. Perhaps she felt proud of what she had accomplished. Perhaps she was simply tired. We will never know all of it. History does not preserve every thought. But we can still imagine the quiet human moments. A woman removing a heavy crown at the end of a ceremony. A mother watching a sleeping child. A widow sitting alone after an emperor's funeral. A religious woman lighting a candle. A ruler studying a letter from a distant province. An older empress listening while younger politicians argue. These moments are not always recorded, yet they help us understand the world behind the grand monuments. The Byzantine Empire was not only a story of emperors and wars, it was also a story of households. And at the heart of the imperial household stood women whose lives were shaped by both privilege and pressure. The empress could live in one of the richest environments of the medieval world. She could have servants, beautiful clothes, fine food, and extraordinary political access. But she could not buy certainty. She could not buy guaranteed loyalty. She could not buy perfect health. She could not guarantee her children's survival. She could not guarantee that her husband would remain emperor. She could not guarantee that tomorrow would resemble today. And perhaps that is true of every human life, no matter how wealthy. The Byzantine Empress simply experienced that uncertainty under a much brighter light. Her mistakes were remembered. Her successes were remembered. Her family was remembered. Her enemies wrote about her. Her supporters praised her. Historians argued about her. Centuries later, we are still trying to understand her. The palace is quiet now. The night is long gone. The morning has arrived completely. The sounds of Constantinople fill the streets. The city has begun another day. And somewhere in the history of that enormous city, an empress is walking through a corridor that no longer exists. Her footsteps are gone. Her servants are gone. The fabrics she wore have disappeared. The people who spoke with her have been silent for centuries. But the story remains. Not because she wore gold. Not because she lived in a palace. But because she lived at the intersection of power, family, religion, and human uncertainty. She was expected to represent an empire. Yet she was still only one person. She could be brave. She could be frightened. She could be clever. She could make mistakes. She could love. She could grieve. She could succeed. She could fail. And through all of it, the empire continued around her. So as we leave the palace, let us imagine one final moment. The empress stands near a window. The morning light enters quietly. Below, Constantinople is waking. The Bosporus moves between the continents. A church bell sounds in the distance. The city smells of bread, smoke, salt, and the sea. For a moment, there is no ceremony, no audience, no political faction, no succession crisis, no historian writing down her name. Only the mourning. She takes a slow breath. Then she turns away from the window. Another day has begun. The crown will return. The responsibilities will return. The palace will become busy again. But for this brief moment, before the noise grows louder, she is simply a woman, standing in the light. And perhaps that is the quietest truth of all. Behind every imperial title was a human life. Behind every ceremony was a person. Behind every golden mosaic was someone who had once stood beneath the same sky we see today. The Byzantine Empire is gone. Its emperors are gone. Its empresses are gone. Its palace has largely vanished. But the sea still moves through the Bosporus. Morning still arrives over Constantinople, and the ancient city, now Istanbul, still wakes beneath the same changing light. The empire has become history, the palace has become memory, and the empress has become a story of luxury and limitation, of influence and uncertainty, of family and politics, of faith and survival, and of what it meant to live at the very top of a world where even the highest crown could never completely control what tomorrow would bring. The morning grows brighter. The city grows louder, and slowly, peacefully, the story comes to an end.